Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Checklist for Murder, the true story of Robert John Peernock, by Anthony Flacco, narrated by Anthony Flacco. Author's Note: the names of certain individuals who are not central to this story have been changed to preserve their privacy. A few small details that have no bearing upon the story's truth have also been altered, once again in the interests of protecting the privacy of those who have done nothing to warrant the dangers of public exposure. Concern for this level of privacy is based upon the fact that elements of lethal threat behind this story remain all too real at the time of this writing. Part 1. Monsters in the Dark. Torture, an extreme physical and mental assault on a person who has been rendered defenseless. Amnesty International. Chapter 1. She lay in the seat listening to the metallic sounds as he tinkered under the Cadillac. Was it safe to move? She still had a little physical control left despite her cuffed hands, her bound ankles, her blindness inside the canvas hood. But long hours in captivity, being force-fed a combination of alcohol and some kind of an unknown drug, had served to take a severe toll. Even though she was a healthy 18-year-old and had always been athletic, by this point it took all her effort just to make her slim body obey her. She reached out over her mother's unconscious form. Slowly she ran trembling fingers down the steering column until at last her fingertips brushed the ignition. The key was still there, but she pulled back. Could she start the car even though her hands were cuffed in front of her? Could she shift the transmission into reverse even though she couldn't see? Stomp on the gas even though her feet were tied? Most of all, could she do it fast enough to run the car over him before he heard her and scrambled out of the way? She had to try. There was no longer any doubt that he was about to kill them both. Once again she leaned over her mother, stretching her cuffed hands out toward the key. But just as her fingertips finally reached the ignition, she realized the sounds under the car had stopped. Sometime before 4 a.m. on July 22, 1987, a motorist named John Dozier pulled over to the side of a desolate road. He peered into the early morning darkness and struggled to focus on a jumble of twisted wreckage off the right-hand shoulder. It seemed to be a single car wreck. No one was moving at the scene. He looked closer. A thin wisp of smoke was rising from the undercarriage of an old Cadillac resting near the side of the road. The rear of the car was still on the gravel shoulder, but the front straddled the remains of a wooden telephone pole. It appeared that the heavy 71 sedan had rammed the pole with such force that it had splintered and collapsed. The front of the car had come to rest on top of the remains of the pole as it lay on the ground. Dozier realized that the wreck must have happened only moments before, and that he was the first to come along. He knew on an isolated strip of road like this one, it might be hours before anyone else chanced by in the darkness. He hurried over, opened the driver's door of the Cadillac, and discovered a petite woman lying inside. She gave no signs of life. He tried to pull her free, but she was jammed under the dashboard beneath the steering wheel. On the floor beside her he could hear a female passenger moaning softly, but the door on the passenger side was jammed in place, and there was nothing he could do to free the second victim either. Then he remembered the thin wisp of smoke rising from under the car. He realized an explosion could happen at any second. Dozier hurried away to find a phone and call for help. At 4:25 on that same July morning, paramedic Clyde Pipehoff was sleeping through the quiet hours of a 24-hour shift at Fire Station 89 in the North Hollywood area of Los Angeles when he received a radio dispatch over his hotline. The call came from the main dispatch center in downtown L.A., located 5 riot-proof floors below ground level. The order directed him to proceed to San Fernando Road near the Tuxford intersection in the neighboring town of Sun Valley. Clyde was a supervisor with the rank of Paramedic 3, serving all county municipalities, so the call was within his jurisdiction. He summoned his partner, Paramedic 2, Todd Carb, and their trainee, Paul Egizi. Within moments they were rolling toward the scene. Clyde's problems began immediately. There are 2 San Fernando roads that intersect Tuxford. He made his best guess and arrived shortly afterward at what he considered the more commonly traveled of the 2 locations. The new strip of road where most of the traffic could be expected to go. There was nothing there. Knowing he was losing precious seconds, he and his crew rushed toward Old San Fernando Road, a lesser-used strip of dead-end road running slightly north of a set of railroad tracks. There they finally spotted the dispatch incident. 4 minutes had elapsed since their call came in. Clyde saw the first body before he and the crew had even exited their ambulance. The woman lay on the floor under the steering wheel, her back against the driver's seat and her head slumped against the door frame. Her knees were jammed up under the dashboard, with her right arm on the floor and her left arm trailing out of the open driver's side door and onto the ground. He did not notice the missing section of the underside of the dash or the exposed brackets for mounting stereo equipment because, in his mind, the woman became Clyde's patient the moment he arrived on the scene. Visibility inside the car was a problem. The dome light was not on, even though the driver's side door was open. His attention was already fixed on assessing her condition, but he suspected that once he reached the woman, his check for vital signs would be useless. In addition to clear evidence of massive blood loss, Clyde's patient had sizable portions of brain matter exposed just above her eyes. After his first quick check of the woman hanging out of the doorway, Clyde saw a second body on the floor of the passenger side. The second passenger, also a female, wasn't moving either. He called for Todd and Paul to circle around the car to look after the second passenger while he knelt by the driver's side passenger to continue his preliminary assessments. The smell of gas is typical in bad car wrecks, but Clyde noticed that the odor from this wreck was unusually strong. Glancing around the interior of the car, he saw puddles of fluid on the floorboards. Alarmed that they could be dealing with an active fuel leak, Clyde quickened his pace. In that first brief moment, he had also noticed that blood was also splattered across the inside of the windshield and over the gearshift area. But there was, oddly, no damage at all to the windshield itself or the steering column. In fact, with the exception of all that blood, the interior of the car did not appear damaged at all. At that moment, he couldn't tell if the splattered blood was from one or both of the women, but when Clyde spotted a thin leather strap, several feet long and knotted at both ends, lying across his patient's face, he immediately began conducting his movements so as to disturb things as little as possible. He had been trained to do it that way whenever something about a simple wreck indicated that it might be a crime scene. Meanwhile, Todd and Paul were having trouble getting the passenger's door pried open. The point of impact was on the right front of the car, but the shock had distorted metal all along the car's right side. Quickly retrieving a manual retractor called a Hayward from their unit, they began working to free the second patient. While Clyde was occupied with his examination of the woman on the driver's side, other details of the scene continued to strike him as strangely out of place. A partially empty bottle of whiskey lay in the driver's footwell, but the odor inside the car was more like gas than alcohol. The driver's clothing was soaked, but there again the odor on the clothing was that of gasoline and not alcohol. Most of all, the driver's head injuries were so severe, her face so bloodied and distorted that he couldn't even guess her age. Clyde couldn't imagine what she might have collided with inside the car that would tear her up so badly, without also showing some sign of damage to the impacted object itself. The urgency of the situation, with the car's interior puddled with gasoline, kept him from continuing his trauma evaluation. With nothing else to go on but his initial impressions, he noted that the driver was small and trim, with no visible signs of aging. He estimated her age to be around 30, while he quickly checked her vital signs. At 4:35 a.m., Clyde pronounced his patient dead at the scene. On the passenger side, Todd and Paul called out to Clyde that the second victim showed faint signs of life. As soon as they began to check her, leaning in the window to determine her condition, they confirmed what Clyde had already noticed. There was a strong odor of gas inside the car. It was pooled on the floor around the second victim, soaking through her clothes. John Dozier had returned to the scene and stood off in the background watching the action. And at that moment he called out a warning to the driver of a street sweeper from a nearby gravel company who had pulled his rig over to protect the scene from traffic. Dozier directed the driver's attention to the source of smoke under the car. When Clyde hurried around to assist his partners in removing the survivor, the street sweeper's driver relayed the warning of fire danger to Clyde. Clyde dropped to his knees and peered under the car. A piece of rope that he would later describe as looking like a wick hung from the undercarriage below the gas tank area. The rope had been partially burned. The end of the rope still smoldered. The smoldering rope made it imperative to immediately get the surviving young woman out and away from the car. It was also vital to get an engine company on the scene for fire-related backup. The deceased driver would have to remain in the car. Clyde ran to his unit and put out the call for additional aid, then rushed back to help Todd and Paul remove the survivor. Given the severity of her injuries, they moved her out as quickly as they could. But like the woman on the driver's side, the passenger had suffered massive trauma about her head and face. It took extra precious seconds to handle her with extreme care as they got her strapped to a backboard with her arms and legs fixed in place and a cervical collar stabilizing her neck. Such precautions are standard under the circumstances, but careful handling of the surviving female became more urgent when they found what appeared to be brain matter on her clothing. The paramedics didn't know yet if the brain matter was hers. They rushed the surviving passenger away on the gurney to begin first aid at a spot behind their ambulance, which had been parked away from any possible flow of gasoline from the wrecked car. They knew it would be a fight to stabilize her enough for the ride to nearby Holy Cross Hospital. With an apparently severe skull fracture and the resulting possibility of coma, the traumatic shock of moving could kill her. The surviving female groaned softly and muttered a few delirious words. Head injury patients tend to go in and out of consciousness, so whenever a victim seems alert enough to speak, paramedics will take the opportunity to attempt a few basic questions to determine if the patient is oriented. Clyde asked her name but got no intelligible answer. All three paramedics were struck by the fact that even away from the accident scene, the young woman's clothing still reeked of gasoline. While Clyde directed the treatment and the gentle questions, he noticed an engine company arriving in response to his call. Firefighters used a 2.5-gallon water gun to soak down the smoldering rope under the car. Then they pulled a hip line over to spray off the accumulated gas under the car, reducing the danger of explosion. Amid the flash of emergency lights, the typical noise of an accident scene was beginning to drone in the pre-dawn darkness. Idling engines rumbled under the crackles of dispatch radios. Todd and Paul continued with the surviving passenger, while Clyde asked the firefighters to leave the deceased woman in place after the fire danger was controlled. He knew that police investigators would not want anything disturbed more than necessary. Meanwhile, Todd and Paul were unable to orient the survivor. She couldn't identify herself, tell what had happened to her, or even say if she knew where she was. Her breath smelled slightly of alcohol, but it seemed unlikely that alcohol could be the cause of her incoherent condition. Natasha Peernock was in the place dreams come from, dreams or nightmares. Her eyes could register forms moving, her ears could register sounds, but her conscious mind had been knocked aside, and the messages coming in through her senses were getting lost somewhere deep within her. They mingled with the rest of her unconscious, with memories, with hallucinations. Whatever was taking place in the three-dimensional world around her, or even in that tiny part of the world right outside her own skin and bones, it would all have to go by without her help, without her attention, without her even taking notice. Arson investigators Michael Camello and Derek Chu responded to the 8600 block of Old San Fernando Road between 5 and 5:30 that morning. They saw a fire engine, a patrol car, and a paramedic ambulance already there, plus a handful of onlookers. The hood and trunk of the car were open. Fire Captain Gene Allen told them that when he had arrived on the scene, he'd found both lids closed, but that his men had to open the hood to check for possible sparking. The firefighters had also taken the trunk key from the ignition in order to open the trunk and make the same check there. Camillo and Chu had been summoned to determine if this was a crime scene. Had someone intended this car and the people inside of it to explode in flames? In those first moments, they learned that a surviving passenger had already been removed from the car and was being given preliminary treatment in the ambulance, but that she was in no condition to offer them any information. The heavy car was built like a battle tank. Despite a collision severe enough to tear down a telephone pole, most of the damage to the car was in the area of the right front fender. Other than having one front wheel collapsed, the car was, incredibly, almost drivable. Inside the passenger compartment, Camello and Chu shared the reactions of the others, amazed that there was no observable damage to the interior, other than a minor ding in an air conditioning vent and a thin crack in the lower right portion of the windshield. Even that small fracture was a single stress crack, not the sort of spidery impact lines that distinguish a blow to the glass from the inside. They observed the deceased woman still in her original position on the driver's floor of the car. Comello spotted a single brown work glove on the floor next to the body and a capped bottle of Seagram's 7. In his experience, it seemed odd for anyone to drive with a large bottle of such hard stuff, but he also knew that people are completely unpredictable in their drinking habits. Comello and Chu noted a large amount of blood on the dash and on the floor. Comello suspected that some of the residue was brain matter. Like the paramedics, he and Chu agreed that the deceased woman was in terrible shape for being in such a well-preserved automobile. Comello looked inside the open trunk. He saw a gas can, scraps of paper, rags, and a wooden stick. It appeared that they had all been burned recently. The rags still felt warm to his touch. He directed photos to be taken while he checked to see if there were any exposed wires that might have ignited the trunk contents in some accidental way. But although he knew that anything is possible with explosive liquids, the trunk fire had already struck arson investigator Comello as being incendiary in nature. The site under the vehicle was also consistent with a crime scene. He noted that the rope wick near the gas tank was wrapped around some type of metal bar. The bar had a sharpened edge and was pointed toward the gas tank, with the tip of the point about half an inch from the fuel supply. The other end of the bar was secured to the car's undercarriage by a single screw. Even though everything under the car was dirty, the single screw holding the pointed bar was shiny and clean. Comello noted some darkening on the underside of the gas tank, appearing to be a hydrocarbon burn residue. The location of the partially burned rope added to Comello's suspicions of attempted arson. But with a dead woman in the front seat and a delirious female pulled from the wreckage, the scene left no doubt in his mind that it revealed arson for the purpose of murder. Somebody had gone to a great deal of trouble to turn this car into an elaborate, self-destructing death machine. Comello then began searching for the source of the gasoline leak. Despite the strong, persistent odor, he could find no ruptures in the tank itself. He untied the end of the rope from the pointed metal bar and pulled the bar's pointed end down, away from the fuel tank. Once the pointed bar no longer blocked his view of the tank, Comello noted that there was a tiny area of the tank's surface that had been scraped clean. It looked as if the point had momentarily brushed the metal, such as it might do in a collision of insufficient force to actually cause a rupture. Thus, it was possible to speculate that if the big Cadillac had not been stopped by the telephone pole, and if the car's huge V8 engine had gone on building momentum until the car hit the retaining wall at the road's dead end, the metal bar could have rammed and punctured the gas tank. With the rope wick still burning and attached to the metal bar secured under the fuel tank, there could have been an explosive, extremely hot fire. With the amount of gasoline pooled inside the heavy car's interior, Comello knew that the county coroner would have been lucky to be able to identify the car's 2 passengers through dental records. Paramedic 3, Clyde Pipehoff, climbed in the back of the ambulance to prepare to load the patient with Paul, the trainee. Todd got in front to drive them to the hospital. After repeatedly asking the patient if she could tell him the name of the other woman in the car, Clyde finally got a momentary response from the young woman. She was able to murmur the name Patty, but did not give a last name. Clyde went back to check the car for IDs and found 2 purses, one with a driver's license in the name of Claire Peernock. He assumed the other purse must belong to Patty, whom his patient had identified as the deceased woman. If the disoriented woman in his ambulance was Claire Peernock, she certainly didn't look like she was over 40 years old, as the California driver's license indicated. In fact, neither of the 2 women looked that old, but their faces were so bloodied and distorted by the trauma that anything was possible. There was no time to sort it out. One of the paramedics tossed Claire Peernock's purse into the ambulance while they all got ready to roll. As the first pale light of pre-dawn began to show, supervising paramedic Clyde Pipehoff greeted the day knowing he had just received a hardcore illustration of the need to be prepared to deal with anything, at any time, on his 24-hour shift. Do you know your name? Do you know where you are? Do you have any idea what happened to you? The gentle questions of the paramedics drifted in Natasha's ears. They stirred reflexes in her brain, even elicited a few partial responses. But those responses, the words and the pieces of words, didn't come from Natasha as anyone knew her. They didn't even come from Natasha as she knew herself. They were spatters from her unconscious thought stream, bubbling up through her vocal cords like sprays of some nonsense conversation held with a sleepwalker. Because Natasha was hovering in a place where things she had done long ago were occurring over and over on a never-ending loop, while things she had only planned to do in the future seemed to have already taken place. Any response that people in the so-called real world would get from her now would only come from far down inside of that place, where dreams and memories and plans and fears all jumble up like brightly colored bits of glass shaken together in a box. The paramedics did everything they could to get her to fight her way back to a semblance of consciousness, but Natasha was wandering the darkness, down where the nightmare factory likes to crank up its assembly line deep in the night, where familiar shapes can turn into monsters and strike out at you, then snap back into harmless images, all in the blink of an eye. She was alone in the innermost chamber of some dark cave where the paramedics, the police, the doctors could not go. They couldn't even summon her back. If Natasha returned at all, she was going to have to come back on her own. Chapter 2. It was after midnight on July 23rd, more than 20 hours after the crash was discovered, when Natasha's consciousness slowly returned. She fought to open her swollen eyelids, but the torn, puffed flesh around her eyes barely let in any light. Overhead lights were on. There was nothing around her to indicate time. Her contact lenses had been removed, leaving a haze she could only see through well enough to realize she was lying in a hospital bed. She got the impression that she was the only patient in the room, but had no idea yet that the severity of her wounds and the intensity of her treatment had dictated a private recovery environment. In fact, she had awakened earlier just long enough to be approved for transfer from the ICU to a private room, but she had no memory of that. Moments later, while she fought back the groggy remnants of anesthesia, she became aware of a nurse puttering about her bedside, adjusting IV drips, monitoring her vital signs. When the nurse saw Natasha's eyes flutter open, she smiled down at her with a detached, professional gaze. "Do you know where you are?" the nurse asked softly. Natasha had to struggle to make her lips form a word, to make her throat push out a sound. "A hospital," her voice rasped out in a dry whisper. "That's right," the RN said, never dropping her trained smile. "How does your head feel? Do you think you could answer a few questions?" What happened?" She pushed the whisper a little harder, but her vocal cords weren't ready to come back online. "Well, it seems that you were in some kind of an accident, a car accident. So can you tell me your name?" "Natasha." She quit pushing her voice and let the whisper do the work. Her mouth was too dry, her tongue felt thick and heavy. "And your last name?" "Peernock." The moment she pronounced her family name, Natasha felt a small shock wave go through her. She wasn't sure why. "Good. And what year is it, Natasha?" Natasha's first name sounded odd coming from this woman. People who know her usually just call her Tasha, sometimes shortening it simply to Tosh. To hear the formality of her full name as she lay helpless only emphasized to her that she was in a strange place. But a moment later she realized that she couldn't answer the question. She didn't know what year it was. At first it felt kind of funny to find a piece of her memory gone. It wasn't like anything she had ever heard about amnesia. After all, she knew who she was. And when the RN told her that this was Holy Cross Hospital, she recognized the name. She had driven by the place in the past. But her memory had been Swiss cheesed, and little pieces were simply missing. She got her street address right, but she couldn't remember the name of the current U.S. president. She could picture his face, but the name was blank. And now another shock wave jolted her. This one was stronger. It shot through her like an icy wind, and suddenly she didn't feel like answering any more riddles. Her right hand rose absently to her forehead and sent strange messages to her brain. Her hair was gone. There were sutured gouges all across her face and head. But the messages were too much to deal with at the moment. My Mother was with me." As Tasha spoke the word mother, it caught in her throat. She didn't know why. She knew, but she couldn't focus on the thought. "Where's my mother?" She kept her voice quiet, almost timid. The nurse was well trained, and her smile hardly wavered. "You can see your mother later." She started for the door. "Rest now. You've just come out of surgery. We were concerned about you there for a while. I'm sure your mother would want you to rest." "My mother," she began again, but the nurse was making good her escape. She was nearly all the way out the door as she turned back to offer one last polished smile. "We'll be coming in and out to check on you," she chirped as she disappeared. But those last words and their artificial assurance didn't matter anyway. Natasha barely heard them. Distant images, sounds, and voices suddenly overwhelmed her. A revolver's chamber spinning next to her ear, over and over and over, crashing sounds of a violent struggle coming from the other side of a bedroom wall, the cold feel of steel handcuffs, the suffocating panic as thin strips tightened around her throat, ropes being pulled tight around her ankles, a voice assuring her that she was going to be killed. The second registered nurse to check on Natasha that evening was just making a routine stop. She didn't know much about the patient. She knew the young woman was a severe head trauma victim of an auto accident earlier that morning. She knew that an ER test had indicated that there was a .053 blood alcohol level hours after the accident. The odor of alcohol had still been on her breath. Traces of some form of narcotic had also been in her bloodstream, most likely another drunken car wreck. The nurse also knew the hospital had been notified that shortly before 11:30 that evening, a neighbor named Carl Rowe had come down to the coroner's office and positively identified the fatality as being this patient's mother. But the RN wasn't about to be the one to get stuck with breaking the news. So she walked into the room determined to do no more than make sure the patient was awake and remaining alert. The nurse would check the IV drip rate, the vitals, assure that the patient's orientation was returning. She would leave the emotional confrontations to somebody else. But the moment the RN stepped inside, the patient turned to her and began to display great anxiety. It's common for head trauma patients to register inappropriate levels of emotion as a side effect of their injuries, so the nurse began her routine and answered the questions with matter-of-fact professionalism. "Where's my mother?" the young woman moaned. "Where? You can see her later," the nurse replied in her prescribed line that had been carefully crafted to tell the truth, even while concealing it. "My father, then, where is he?" The young woman's voice was still thick from anesthesia, from the trauma. Clearly she was forcing herself to speak, showing great concern. Still, the symptoms were common enough, not at all unusual for a head trauma victim. "I don't think your father was involved. No one said anything to me about a male victim being at the scene. Don't worry. Try to get some rest. You took a real—" "No! My father! The police! My father!" The nurse had finished her brief check. There were a lot of other patients left to go. The workload left no time for chat. "Try to rest. You were in a serious accident." The RN remained in the doorway for a moment longer than her schedule permitted. The patient was so distraught that the nurse paused to offer more reassurances, telling her not to worry about her father for the time being, reciting the line about how she could see her mother later. There wasn't much else she could do to ease the patient's agitated state. Strong tranquilizers can't be given to head injury patients so soon after surgery, and the nurse couldn't stay any longer to offer personal comfort. So she just made a mental note to add a few extra stops to this room on top of the usual schedule of every 15 minutes that the patients in critical recovery normally get at Holy Cross. And then she was gone. In the back of her mind, she was already reviewing the history on the next patient. Even though Natasha lay helpless, unable to take any physical action, old mental skills that she had honed with years of practice went to work automatically. She struggled to focus her mind, to force herself to remember everything and glue it all into place. She ran through the memories as if through a piece of film, staring hard at the mental images just as she had learned to do years ago, back when some inner wisdom had told her that the very first resource of those who refuse to be willing victims is to remember. Remember everything. Remember with a vengeance. Part of her wondered fearfully where her father was at that very moment. Was he nearby, trying to get into the hospital? Would she even know him if he appeared in the room? Without her contact lenses, she couldn't see as far as...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?